I've always been involved in the sheep industry. I'm still running a few yearlings, and I started out in 1969 with the first sheep I bought, and Candace called me on this and said she'd like to have a little bit of a talk on the sheep deal a little bit, and I thought, well, gee whiz, where do I go from here? How do I relate this to the cattle industry, the sheep industry, and everything? I started looking up things, and the first thing I kind of clicked on is because my son-in-law talked to me about these sheep numbers worldwide, and I just couldn't believe what I seen when I drew that up. And I knew that Australia had a lot of sheep, and I knew that New Zealand had a lot of sheep, and I kind of wondered where that was at. But when I looked it up, I was totally shocked. I think I got another. Let's see here. No. How do I back this thing up? Red button? Okay, there. I might have missed one here, but no, I guess not. Anyhow, the total sheep numbers in the world, the first thing I run into was China, and China has 187 million sheep, and this was about the time they was opening up our exports of cattle to China, and that tells me that China's not really short on the red meat or the protein supply. And so then I investigated a little more and was curious, and lo and behold, India is the second largest producer of sheep in the world. Maybe you guys know this stuff, but I was kind of unaware, and I've run sheep all my life. And the question I asked then, well, where's Australia and New Zealand? Well, Australia is about fourth on the list. Sudan, although a lot of these third world countries, the numbers are not real accurate on them. Sudan's got a lot of sheep, little country in Africa. Got to looking at that, and Australia, gee whiz, looked at the historical numbers in Australia. Man, they just don't have the sheep they used to have. They're down 60% to what they were 20 years ago. We look at New Zealand, they're down about 40% to what they were 20 years ago. But when I went back 20 years on China, they had 113 million sheep, and now they're running 187 million. They've increased like crazy. I read a little more about Sudan, and they've got a large number of sheep, and they're poised to increase possibly by 2/3 to 3 times as many as what they have now. The question I ask on this, we're importing 60% of our lamb and mutton here in the United States. Where are those imports going to come from? Are we going to trade our cattle exports to China for sheep from China or Sudan? What about the disease control? China's been kind of notorious for sending us stuff that's, not real healthy for the American public. We've had all kinds of sheetrock issues and dog food and you name it. And, I personally am not too worried about the Australians and New Zealand, but all of these developed countries are losing their sheep numbers. So I dug a little more, and actually I went down and had Sylvia dig it out because I was having trouble finding anything. And guess what? All the developing countries are losing their sheep numbers. So if they're dropping their numbers, the good quality developed countries, why? Well, it comes down to labor, predators, and I'm not sure what they have for predators in New Zealand, but over here we've got a couple of them. I think they're named coyotes and wolves and mountain lions and so forth that kind of raise heck with the sheep industry. But and as you can see in this graph, that if you can't read the legend on it, there we are. Well, okay. There we go. That blue line is Australia, and it demonstrates how they've lost numbers. The yellow line is New Zealand. They've lost numbers, and yet you see that Chinese number just rising substantially, and India is actually rising substantially. I think India, to a certain degree, will eat anything they raise, but They don't always butcher or kill anything, so you never know. I'm not sure where that's at. But anyhow, it concerned me a little bit. And then the Sudan thing really concerns me, because Sudan is, as Kenny was talking about, disease and keeping it out of our borders and so forth. Africa has some huge disease problems, some of which are transmittable to humans. And actually, China had to shut down a lot of wool exports a few years ago because their workers, they actually lost like 300 workers in their wool industry, but from wool that was imported from Africa. So, you know, there's some real issues with the sheep industry, and I think it's something that's going to affect our cattle industry. And, you know, Bill Bullard has made the statement several times that this sheep industry is a canary in the coal mine, you know. And I was talking to Dave Olalaw, who's our extension specialist for South Dakota on sheep, and I asked him, Dave, what's major issues with sheep and increasing our numbers here in the United States? And he said, well, of course, price. Well, I said, well, let's elaborate on that a little bit. And he said, well, he gave me a website to go to and look into prices and so forth. And so I did that, but I was having real problems with it, I'll admit. I'm not too expert on that computer. And kind of was looking at it, and a few years ago, well, about 10 years ago, I made some income comparisons to livestock products and some of the wages and manufacturing jobs and so forth. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to do that again. And so I did. I lined it up here on your income comparisons. And the top line up there is the mine. Let's see. Yeah, that's the mining industry. And the second is manufacturing wages and so forth. Transportation, their income and wages. Then overall agriculture, now that's your wage earning part of it, not your product consumption. And then I went down and I put in the lamb and the wool and wheat, and I had to kind of play with the chart a little bit to get it to look right. But I put in wheat, I believe, by the ton, and wool by the hundredweight, so that you could more easily see the price differences. And the question that I have, you know, Michael Stumo brought it up, and about the labor in China and India and stuff. That came up in his speech. And I think that's the reason we see the sheep there, is because of the fact that the labor is so cheap over there. And thank goodness somebody's still raising sheep. But you can kind of see how our prices of those three commodities are just not keeping up with other wages and prices. The one thing that I got a question about, and I've always had it, and I understand that it goes kind of beyond a lot of the value of the dollar and the trade values and so forth. But you know, when I was a kid, 1958 to be exact, my dad was buying lambs and selling lambs, and he ended up with a load of lambs we took over to Newell Sale Barn, which was still active at that time. And he was rather proud of the fact that he got 20 cents for them lambs. I don't remember what they weighed, but he said, yeah, you can buy 4 bottles of pop for that pound of lamb. And I don't know why that stuck in my mind, but it did. Now, if I can get 4 bottles of pop for a pound of lamb now, you know, I'd be awful happy, because that pop's running $1 to $1.25 a can. You know, I could live on $5 lambs. I really could. And same way with the wool. You know, I don't know the price comparison there, but it's interesting that, you know, the strong dollar or the weak dollar, where's it at in comparison to what we buy? You know, and that illustrates it. You know, our calf dollar, our lamb dollar, just does not purchase what it used to. And I always struggled with that when they talk about the strong dollar and the weak dollar in trade and so forth. Okay, the next thing that Dave brought up, the second issue with raising sheep, of course, is the predators, as I mentioned before. And this here chart kind of shows, and the thing that concerned me there was the number of coyotes that they're taking in comparison to past years. And I live in Meade County, and you know, when we have 584 coyotes taken in 2016 and 266 or 299 in 2012, you know, that's a heck of an increase in coyote numbers. And as many of you, we've talked about wolves and mountain lions and so forth, and all of them things are showing up in our South Dakota region too, and especially the wolf deal. You know, I don't think anybody will raise sheep if the wolf numbers get very high. But this is just some of the issues that's happening in the sheep industry. And I thought I'd kind of be promotional because you know, there's some interesting things because we import 60% of our lamb and mutton in the United States here, and we're also importing wool now, which is kind of interesting. But because we import that amount of volume, if Trump would do what he'd say and cut down on this stuff coming in and put more restrictions on it and so forth, the sheep industry could be poised for a heck of a explosion in price and opportunity. So one thing I did is I kind of went through a production deal a little bit. And, you know, sheep are a little different than cattle. You know, the more you put into them, the more labor you put into them, the more they tend to return to you. And that's one thing that I've always felt, because I kind of got started with sheep, and I know that I put a lot of effort into them when I first had them and got a lot of return out of them. And so I did this on I kind of compared a confined system, which is what I've got up on the chart now, figuring 150% lamb crop on 100 ewes and the wool and so forth, and the income that it would generate. And you know, when you figure that it takes, you know, you can run about 5 ewes or 5 or 6 ewes to a cow, you know, that starts getting pretty attractive for a young person when his investment's real low. And but it does take a lot of labor to do that. Well, then I went through the costs on it a little bit, and so you can see there that you got a good return on confined system on sheep, and it's an opportunity for young people to take advantage of. Then I went through. Let's see. Oh, okay. That's still on that. Yeah, that's on the confined system. Then I went through on a range lambing operation, figuring 100% lamb crop and so forth. My son-in-law is running sheep on that basis, trying to kill a little leafy spurge and get rid of it along the Potter River there. And he never looks at them sheep. He turns them out. He's got some dogs with him and stuff, so they're strictly a range operation. And so we figured it out at 100% and you know, the price of market lambs and this kind of thing, and we came up with this total income of about $172, and your expenses at about $139. So, you know, there's opportunity here for young people that want to fool around with sheep, and it's a chance to get started. And I don't know, you know, the sheep deal is one thing that I was kind of instrumental in getting and RCAF involved in the sheep industry, and I really do feel there's a lot of opportunity in the industry in the future, especially if we can get these exports or imports in balance a little bit. And I think it offers a huge opportunity to some of our younger producers that really want to put a lot of effort into it and haven't much land or investment to work with. So I've always been an advocate of the sheep industry because of the young people. And I started with nothing, and I'm not bragging or complaining. That's just the way it was, and I've had to do a lot of outside work and do a lot of other things, but I finally made it work. And you know, I hate to see the opportunity for other young people to not be able to do that. And by not giving us a decent price, and Bill Bullard has worked hard on the cattle industry, trying to get our prices up there where they're good. Country of origin is a big thing like that. The sheep deal, if we was to start, you know, importing some of the sheep from some of these foreign countries, the country of origin might become important on the sheep. But when you're importing 60% of them from countries like Australia and New Zealand that have good programs and so forth, then it is not near as you know, influencing on the prices as what it would be on the cattle. But it's still there, and it's still a protection for us, and I think it's a great tool to work with. And yeah, I kind of tried to keep this short, but if there's any questions on the sheep deal, I'll try to answer them. One of the things I was going to bring up too is the mandatory price reporting. When I got to digging into this stuff, one of the things I run into was I couldn't get no numbers. It didn't make sense. It just wasn't listed at all. And so I called Mike Schultz because I knew he'd been going to them mandatory price reporting meetings, and I said, "What's the deal with this sheep thing? I can't get numbers to come up. There's some of them got lines through them, some of them got zeros, and then once in a while they'll have a price for the lambs." And I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, that line says there was no lambs reported at all. The zero says there was less than 250,000. Any place it's listed, there was more than 250,000 reported." Well, with imports not listed, forward contracted lambs not listed, there's not enough lambs to reported to even make it viable. So in other words, the sheep buyer, the guy that's feeding lambs and so forth, has no idea what the price is. He's just got to kind of guess in the dark and see what he got last time and see if he can buy them at that price, which is done a little bit anyhow. But so our mandatory price reporting on the sheep deal, unless we get a broader use of that, it just isn't going to help us any. So anyhow, if there's any questions, well, I'll try to answer them. So.